15-minute session on the role of philanthropy in tackling the development finance gap. And I'm joined here by Caroline Fiennes, Director of Giving Evidence, and Richard Hawkes, Chief Executive of the British Asian Trust, who've been working in this field for a long time. So, okay. Caroline, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. So, you talked a little bit when we were backstage about the fact that the role of philanthropy in this space is not to fill a massive financing gap, but to be kind of catalytic and to be kind of the cause of change here. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how that's going to work, how you think that should work?
Yeah, so there's various roles I think that philanthropy can play usefully in a world in which for-profit investors are operating. One is ensuring the business of government and governance within a country happens properly and competently. So in order for anything in a country to happen, including any commercial investment to be viable, you need decent public institutions, you need low corruption, for example, you need a level of transparency, you need a level of truthfulness. Basically, the role of philanthropy in any setting is to do things that the market can't do, or which the market won't do. And there's a certain amount, all those things I just mentioned about transparency and reducing corruption and ensuring truthfulness are things that are very difficult for the market to do, but which civil society organisations and philanthropy can do. So organisations like Full Fact, for example, the UK's fact-checking charity, which makes it harder for people to talk BS in the public domain and to mislead. Organisations like Bellingcat, the investigative journalists, which make it harder to do misdeeds and to cover them up. Like the Institute for Government does, for example, in ensuring that we have civil servants and government officials who are, well-trained and competent. All of that. A lot of work that Giving Evidence has been involved with around ensuring that governments use good evidence in making their policies and that they are able to find that evidence, that it exists, that it's structured in a way that makes it findable and that they can use it. All of that are really strong roles for philanthropy, which the market is never going to do, but every commercial investment relies on. I was reading an article just on the way here about how if you look at corruption indexes between countries, the Nordic countries always come out really low as having low corruption. They also come out really high on economic indicators and on social indicators and on social progress indicators and on equality measures. And those things are not unrelated, that in order for us to do anything, we need that kind of bedrock of a functioning state, and philanthropy can play a massive role there.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about this idea of the civil society as the kind of tug, and the much larger pool of development capital as the kind of tanker that is being moved and manoeuvred by that.
Yeah, so sometimes there are examples where good philanthropy, I often think it's like a tug and a tanker. Philanthropy is quite small in the global scheme of things, particularly relative to the amount of investment capital or government budgets. And so a good use of philanthropy is rarely in delivering a service or in just delivering a service, right? Because that's really what the state should be doing. But much better is if the philanthropy can work to kind of move a machine that's much bigger than itself, a tanker much bigger than itself. So this is what I mean about ensuring that government officials are able to find and use evidence in their policy making, so that their education policy or their health policy or their species conservation strategy or whatever it is based on decent evidence and effective. There are loads of examples, and Giving Evidence works with donors on these all the time, about where a small amount of money into a well-run intervention and program can influence money that's much bigger than itself.
Yeah. And Richard, the British Asian Trust has been doing this in practice. You're an organisation that takes philanthropic capital and kind of develops new ways of doing things in order to kind of influence the much larger pools of kind of development finance that are out there. Do you want to talk a bit about kind of how that's worked in practice?
Yeah, okay. So, first of all, I'm not going to disagree with anything that Caroline said, mainly because she'd beat me in any argument if we were to try and have one. I think, to answer your first question, though, there is a massive gap. And that can't be filled by philanthropy, but there is a massive role that philanthropy can play. So when you look at whichever number you choose to take in terms of the funding gap to achieve the SDGs, despite the huge progress that has been made over the last 20, 30 years, we're just not going to get that amount of money in. And so what we believe really strongly at the British Asian Trust is, therefore, the system as it is at the moment has got to change. There's got to be new vehicles. There's got to be new ways of doing things. You can close the gap by getting more money in, but you can also close it by making the money that is in the system at the moment more efficient, more effective, more accountable. And I think, if we're all brutally honest, a lot of the money that is in the system at the moment isn't based on evidence, isn't based on data. It often funds short-term activities and interventions rather than being outcomes focused, and so on. There is then a massive role for philanthropy in being able to take risks that other funders might not be able to take, in being able to tolerate failure and learn from that. And so one of the initiatives, and I know that this came up in an earlier session talking about development impact bonds, but we've had a huge amount of success with development impact bonds at the British Asian Trust. So we've recently got the results of an education impact bond that's been running for 4 years in India. And despite COVID, the kids that were part of the programme learned 2.5 times more than kids that were not part of the programme. And that was mainly because the way the structure worked enabled the local education providers to determine what they were going to do, as opposed to international NGOs or funders telling them what to do. And the risks were borne by risk investors. And so what that meant was that the philanthropists and the trusts and foundations and so on that were putting their funding in, their funding was de-risked. And so they were only funding success. And so with that question, for me, I think there is a massive role for philanthropy in helping to close that gap by funding the kinds of things that Caroline's talked about, but also looking at new structures, new innovative ways of doing things that can drive greater efficiency and effectiveness in the system overall.
Can I give you an example?
Certainly, go ahead.
This is my new favourite example. It's from Senegal. No one ever has examples from Senegal. So in Senegal, big education problem that people speak lots of local languages. The main one is Wolof, but everything happens in French. So you could turn up at school, age 4 or 5, having never spoken French in your life, and suddenly, boom, everything is in French, and you understand essentially nothing. But like if you and I suddenly went to learn maths in Chinese or something. And there is a small non-profit called ARED, and they figured out a way of doing bilingual instruction where you simply teach children basically in a language that they actually understand. It's a good idea, right? And Dubai Cares, which is, I'm going to get the wrong way around, no, Hewlett Foundation paid for them to get it to a reasonable size and to do an RCT of it, a rigorous evaluation of the effectiveness of it. And that showed that it was really effective in helping children to learn more in all subjects, including French. And then Dubai Cares, a big Dubai-based foundation, paid for them to scale it further and to work with the government to implement it in some schools and to do another rigorous evaluation of it. And that shows that it works at scale. And now they're cranking it out across the whole country, this kind of program and approach. And by the way, next door in Mauritania, they're also doing something similar. And that all came from, this is a good example of a tug on a tanker, right? Because paying for that initial scaling work and those 2 rigorous evaluations, it's not that expensive in the scheme of things, certainly not relative to the budget of a whole country. It only costs, and their summer program that they just ran, which a donor of mine was involved with, cost about 80 quid per child.
Fair enough. And Richard, are you seeing that as well, that private finance capital coming in behind the work that you're doing and kind of taking it to scale, learning those lessons, creating new ways of doing things?
Yeah, definitely, because in some of the structures that we've run, what we're actually doing is, well, the great thing with something like an impact bond is your starting point is what are you trying to achieve and how are you going to measure that? And I've worked in this sector for 30 years, and usually the starting point is never that. It's, what do I think might be a good solution here? And so by spending a lot of time working out what you want to achieve and how you're going to measure it, you can then try a range of different interventions and gather the data and evidence from those. So for me, something like real scale is achieved when you're able to demonstrate, by using the data and evidence from a structure like the ones that we've been working on, to government, for example, which education interventions are going to lead to the greatest result. And so one of the things that we've been able to do is build on our education development impact bond. And we've just started, a year ago, we started a much larger impact bond in skilling in partnership with the government of India, because they want to transform the way that the skills providers are providing skills training. And they want to move away from the main measurement in skills being how many certificates are given out at the end of a skills training to how many people are getting a job and then staying in a job. And so the new outcome bond, impact bond that we're working on in partnership with the government is the outcomes are about job retention. So it's not even about the skills providers working with an employer to get somebody in a job. It's about job retention. Now, if you can use a structure like this to drive that kind of change overall that can then be scaled by the government, then you really are making a massive achievement at scale.
And they're also, in terms of the financing gap between what's needed and what's available, if I think I'm right in saying there's quite a number of social impact bonds and development impact bonds now where the money for delivery has come from money which was not hitherto available for what one might call social purposes.
Yeah,
it was like full play commercial capital in pension funds, whatever. So this is like a massive contribution to actually bringing more supply in.
Or in our education impact bond, again, one of the outcomes funders was British Telecom.
Oh, wow.
So they came on board because they wanted to be part of something that was innovative and driving change. Now, they wouldn't have put the amount of money that they put into that into education in India if it hadn't been for that vehicle. So definitely, they can attract new money as well as driving effectiveness and efficiency and leading to greater scale.
Okay, and how do you think that one...
Can I just make an intervention? And I know people will, from the floor. Chorus did an evaluation of the FCDO impact bond portfolio, and their conclusion, just to contradict what you said, I think it's a point of order, was that it didn't bring in any new money, so in aggregate in a significant way. So
okay, that's different to what I remember as the conclusion from a study at Blavatnik in Oxford. I may have misremembered it, or they may have a different data set. I often talk about the need to look at multiple studies of the same thing, because single studies can often be a bit misleading based on their sample size.
But also there are examples of risk investors coming on board as risk investors and then saying they will reinvest the funding that they put in, if they get it back, into other development programs. And that's funding that wouldn't have been in the system before.
I think you've summed up, and I don't want to make this about me and the impact bond. The benefit of the impact bond is exactly what you said, that it allows people to experiment and delivers things that can then be, and that's the success, and then the implementation can often be outside. So I think there's lots of merit in impact bonds that are very useful, but they haven't scaled themselves.
Some of you are probably in companies that have foundations which do philanthropic work, and so part of the message of this is that the money that's in the foundations can be used enormously cleverly to help deliver the SDGs. But it does need to be done quite cleverly, and it's almost never best used for simply doing delivery, because there are existing buckets of money that should be doing that. But there are these touch points, and my job and your job is to find them for donors, is the kind of where it can be a tug influencing a much bigger tanker.
Yes, and I don't want to get too caught up on development impact bonds. Those are one of many, many, many tools in this market, and quite a niche one, I think. Certainly a powerful one for civil society, but there are many other ways that philanthropic money can go in, use grants, influence people, not kind of use kind of influencing or convening powers, not spending any money at all, really, just bringing different parties together. Is
that a question?
Well, I was hoping somebody would follow up and respond to it. But
so a good example is the Clean Air Task Force, if any of you know them. So they work on climate change, as the name suggests, and probably many of you are involved in clean tech investments, and that's all great. And what they do is kind of way up the chain, working with the commercial money and government players and investors and providers and the energy companies to figure out what can a sustainable system for a country or indeed a region, what can a sustainable and adequate energy system look like? And so what are all the roles that need to happen differently in 20 years, 50 years' time? And how do we need to start planning for that immediately? That's the kind of convening work, which again, the market won't do, but somebody has to do. Otherwise, all you end up with is like a bazillion decentralized off-grid solar, and no one's actually built a proper grid that is resilient against weather shocks.
And very quickly on your previous point, David, I don't think anybody would claim that interventions like development impact bonds are the answer to everything. But equally, grant funding isn't the answer to everything. And there needs to be new initiatives. Something's got to, we need to shake up the system. We need to lead towards donor funding being more accountable, as I said, looking at greater efficiencies, effectiveness, using data and evidence better. And so what we're finding at the British Asian Trust is some of our programmes that we don't think would be appropriate for a development impact bond, we're learning from the processes that we've implemented in a development impact bond structure to apply to the more traditional grant and philanthropy funding. So to make sure there's a greater focus on outcomes, for example. And so it's things like that that can drive that wider change.
Lovely. Okay, well, with that, I think we're going to have to wrap things up. We've reached the end of that session. So we'll be joined on stage next by my colleague Advar Saldinger, who was speaking to you all this morning. Thank you very much for your time.